Okay, so Brentano famously remarked that intentionality is the mark of the mental. Now, intentionality, that just refers to aboutness, right? So my thought that humans exist is about humans. It's like referred to humans. It's about them. It's directed towards them. The proposition that dogs exist, for instance, is about dogs, and so on. So you can think of intentionality helpfully as aboutness. The Brentano problem, which that's my term, by the way, that refers to the purported superiority of conceptualist, and in this context, divine conceptualist accounts, over Platonic accounts due to the intentionality exhibited by various abstract objects. Of concern for present purposes are propositions, which are, roughly speaking, non-linguistic entities that are the primary bearers of truth values and are expressed by declarative sentences. So a number of authors, for example, Anderson and Welty, in their 2011 paper, you can see on the left here, The Lord of Non-Contradiction, an Argument for God from Logic, as well as Pruss and Rasmussen in their 2018 book, Necessary Existence, shown on the right here. A number of these authors have pointed to the intentionality of propositions as better accounted for under theistic conceptualism than Platonism. According to Anderson and Welty, propositions are identical to thoughts in the divine intellect. Identifying propositions with thoughts, they argue, is this, quote, the simplest and least arbitrary, end quote, account thereof. They continue, unless we have some good independent reason for insisting that propositions are not mental items, we should conclude on the basis that they possess the distinctive mark of the mental that propositions are indeed mental items, rather than positing a sui generis ontological category for them to occupy. One might go so far as to say the principle of parsimony demands it. Propositions then are best construed as mental in nature. Now, other suspiciously thought-like features of propositions are, as Pruss and Rasmussen point out on page 139 of their book, that, quote, they bear entailment relations, they exemplify truth and falsehood, and they are arguably built of more basic intentional components, end quote. These deep similarities between thoughts and propositions are, quote, least surprising if propositions are thoughts or are essential components of thoughts, end quote. That's also from Pruss and Rasmussen, page 139. Now, there seem to be two considerations here purportedly favoring theistic conceptualism over Platonism about propositions, and you can see those two on the screen there. First, identifying propositions with thoughts is simpler than the Platonic account, since one, we already have thoughts in our ontology. Two, non-mental but intrinsically intentional Platonic objects would be a sui generis, categorically different kind of thing from other things in our ontology. And three, theistic conceptualism preserves a categorically uniform account of intentional items as uniformly mental, unlike the Platonic view, which posits a break in this uniformity. Second, identifying propositions with thoughts gives us a good explanation of why and how propositions exhibit the various above-mentioned suspiciously thought-like characteristics. We already know that thoughts are intentional. Indeed, we are intimately familiar with this fact. And so if we can assimilate propositions to thoughts, we will have a neat explanation of their intentional features. By contrast, their intentionality seems to be primitive or brute on the Platonic account. How they represent is thus a mystery. Now, these are valuable challenges for Platonism. I'm not going to pretend to resolve the Brentano problem in the space of this section of the video, but I am going to provide 6 responses that, by my lights, significantly weaken its force. So first, it seems quite implausible that parsimony supports theistic conceptualism vis-a-vis Platonism. I mean, it's true that Platonism, by dint of its non-spatio-temporal abstracta, has a sui generis fundamental kind of object in its ontology. But Platonism doesn't, or at least doesn't automatically, have a sui generis fundamental kind of object of a different sort, namely God himself, that Anderson and Welty's theistic conceptualism does have. Anderson and Welty, just as much as the Platonists, posit a categorically different fundamental kind of thing, a non-spatio-temporal supreme mind, right? Platonism makes no such posit, but the point is that Anderson and Welty themselves, in their own account of abstracta, likewise have to posit a categorically different fundamental kind of thing. And Platonism doesn't do that with respect to the divine intellect. So both of them have this kind of categorically different fundamental sui generis kind of thing. So while divine conceptualism might be more parsimonious than Platonism with respect to its commitment to intentional objects being uniformly mental, it is nevertheless less parsimonious with respect to its commitment to a categorically different kind of concrete thing. Though, interestingly, theistic conceptualism, in Greg Welty's manifestation, violates the uniformity of thoughts in a different way. For under Welty's view, God's thoughts, unlike every other thought we know, are not causally dependent on their thinker, in this case, God. By contrast, the Platonists can maintain that all thoughts are uniformly causally dependent on their thinkers. So at best, then, I'm going to say parsimony considerations seem to be awash between the two views. They don't seem to support theistic conceptualism over Platonism. Now, Alex Malpass, who is worth quoting at length, makes a related point about parsimony in reference to the quoted passage from Anderson and Welty. This is from Alex Malpass's paper in Sophia, responding to the Lord of Non-Contradiction. I think you can find that paper on his blog, Use of Reason. So here's what Malpass says, quoting from the screen here. Roughly speaking, thoughts are private to those who think them, right? You cannot literally think my thoughts. But propositions are paradigmatically shareable. We can each think thoughts with the same propositional content. Frege contends that there must therefore be three basic categories of things: physical objects, thoughts, and propositions. Anderson and Welty effectively also recognize three types of things: physical objects, private thoughts, and shareable thoughts. Therefore, it is not so obvious that parsimony considerations decisively tell in favor of their alternative, which also requires the positing of a third category of thing, shareable thoughts. Right? The reason that they have to posit shareable thoughts is that, right, under their view, God's thoughts are, at least some of them, are numerically identical to propositions. And moreover, you and I can think of one and the same proposition, and that's going to have to be God's thought, right? So God's thoughts aren't private, or at least the ones that are identical to propositions that you and I entertain. Those aren't private. They're shareable. You and I have access to them. We think like literally his same thoughts. But that's unlike our thoughts. Like, I don't think literally your thoughts. I have the same content as your thoughts, but I don't think your thoughts. And in that case, Anderson and Welty themselves have this kind of tripartite ontology. They have physical things, private thoughts, and shareable thoughts. It's similar to what the Platonist has. It's the tripartite ontology. And so this is yet another place where both of them have a kind of parsimony deficiency. And so I conclude that parsimony considerations don't favor theistic conceptualism over Platonism. I'm not saying Platonism is simpler. I'm just saying parsimony considerations don't favor theistic conceptualism over Platonism. So that's my first response to the Brentano problem. My second response is that arguably the representational character or intentionality of propositions isn't all that mysterious under at least some prominent accounts of propositions. So take, for instance, the account developed in Josh Rasmussen's book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, from pages 85 to 119. According to this account, propositions are non-spatial arrangements or combinations or organizations of properties and relations. An example is particularly helpful for understanding this account. So now we're quoting from the screen. The proposition that Tibbles is on the mat contains a property that is necessarily unique to Tibbles and a property that is necessarily unique to the mat that Tibbles is on. I will refer to the first property as Tibbles and the second as the mat. I propose then that the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat is a non-spatial arrangement or organization of the properties being Tibbles and the property being the mat. Like every arrangement, the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat consists of things tied together by one or more relations. In this case, the arrangement consists of the property being Tibbles standing in a certain linking relation to the property being the mat to form the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat, end quote. Now, Josh then provides the following analysis of aboutness. Quoting again, proposition P is about a thing X if and only if P contains a property that is necessarily unique to X. Thus, a proposition is about something by containing a property that is essentially unique to that thing. So, for example, the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat is about Tibbles and a particular mat because the proposition contains the property being Tibbles and the property being the mat, which are properties that are necessarily unique to Tibbles and a particular mat, respectively. This analysis that Josh provides, moreover, illuminates the aboutness of other intentional objects like token thoughts. If one thinks that Tibbles is on the mat, then one's thought is itself an arrangement composed of oneself, quote, bearing a certain mental relation, such as entertaining, to the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat, end quote. From Josh again. The proposition that Tibbles is on the mat is thus part of one's thought, right? It is the thought's content. Quote, since the property being Tibbles and the property being the mat are parts of the proposition that Tibbles is on the mat, continues Rasmussen, by transitivity, they are also parts of my thought. And since these parts are themselves unique to Tibbles and the mat, respectively, it follows that my thought that Tibbles is on the mat is about Tibbles and the mat, end quote. Rasmussen also proceeds to apply the account of intentionality to concepts. Now, my purpose here is not to defend this analysis of propositions and their aboutness. It is rather to point out that there seem to be prima facie defensible Platonic views which do not render propositions as intentionality wholly mysterious and which unify the intentionality of propositions, thoughts, and concepts under a single explanatorily powerful account. And that brings us to my third response to the Brentano problem. And that response is that Platonic accounts need not and arguably should not posit a break in the uniformity of intentional items, for example, as broken into two fundamentally different kinds of things, namely propositions and thoughts. Recall that one of the parsimony advantages theistic conceptualism was alleged to possess over Platonism was that it provides a categorically uniform account of intentional items as indeed uniformly mental. But arguably, the Platonists can likewise provide a categorically uniform account of intentional items. Propositions are the fundamental intentional items, and thoughts derive their intentionality from being appropriately related to propositions. This is precisely the account Rasmussen provided earlier. It's a simple account that unifies intentional items together under one notion of aboutness predicated on individual specific properties. While the Platonist then does have two different categories of intentional items, namely propositions and thoughts, the Platonist only needs one fundamental category of intentional items. And arguably, it is the fundamental categories in one's ontology that matter for parsimony purposes. So again, I just don't even find this Brentano problem all that convincing because Platonic accounts, in fact, contra this Brentano problem, don't need to posit a break in the uniformity of intentional items. Okay, so that's my third response. Now, my fourth response. So fourth, in contradistinction to the Brentano problem, it's not clear that theistic conceptualism actually provides an illuminating explanation of the intentionality of propositions. I mean, sure, God's thoughts are intentional, but why? Like, what explains their intentionality, right? In virtue of what are they about things? Is it just primitive? If so, then the divine conceptualist is in no better position than a Platonist who takes the intentionality of propositions to be primitive. Is it in the very nature of thought to be intentional? Maybe so, but the same response seems equally available to a Platonist, right? It's in the very nature of Platonic propositions to be intentional. We are owed an account of the intentionality of God's thoughts, it seems, if theistic conceptualists want to claim that they have a better explanation of propositions' intentionality than the Platonist. Now, that task might be particularly difficult for the classical theist, given God's radical transcendence and thoroughgoing dissimilarity to our intellects. I mean, do we even have a sufficient grasp of what it is for God, the pure act of being itself, to think something or to have a thought? It's not clear that we do under classical theism. In fact, and this is my fifth response, it's not clear how the intentionality of divine thoughts under divine conceptualism is even intelligible. I mean, the divine conceptualism with which we're concerned says that propositions are numerically identical to God's thoughts. Consider then God's thought that is identical to the law of non-contradiction. What is that thought about? Well, I mean, we might be tempted to say it's about the proposition reporting the law of non-contradiction, but that proposition is numerically identical to that thought. And so it means the thought is about itself. It is, moreover, only about itself. I mean, it would be exceedingly strange and indeed arbitrary if the thought that is identical to the law of non-contradiction were also about bunnies or chicken skewers or Richard Dawkins' hair or the Pythagorean theorem. Moreover, the propositions about those things are already identical to other divine thoughts. But at least two problems arise here when we say that God's thoughts are about and only about themselves. So the first problem is one mounted by Alex Malpass in that paper that I was referencing earlier. Thoughts simply cannot be only about themselves, or so Malpass argues. So he writes, and I'm quoting from the screen now. Imagine that Sam is having a thought T, which has a proposition P as its content. So the proposition P is the content of Sam's thought T. We will write that as follows, T of P. All we want to insist on is that the logical form of such an expression requires that T and P must be distinct. The expression T of T is necessarily false. Of course, Sam could become self-aware and reflect on her own thinking. She can think about her own thought. But when she does this, the thought becomes the content of a new, distinct thought. This type of self-awareness is of the form T prime of T, and not T of T. Self-awareness is hierarchical, not truly reflexive. End quote. So that's the first quote on here. This second quote I'm going to get to soon, at the very bottom, that second paragraph. So I do find this rejoinder plausible. from Malpass, but not entirely convincing. I mean, there seem to be cases where a thought takes itself and only itself as its content. I mean, consider the thought that this very thought is a thought, or the thought that this thought I'm entertaining right now has a qualitative character. I mean, those seem to be thoughts that are about themselves, right? And only about themselves. They're not also about bunnies or what have you. And I don't know, it seems as though I can think them. There seem to be cases where a thought takes itself and only itself as its content, contra what Malpass argues in this first paragraph here. Now, perhaps Malpass will argue that these purported wholly self-intentional thoughts spawn a vicious regress. Malpass asks us to consider the benign T-schema regress. If P, then it is true that P. If it is true that P, then it is true that it is true that P, and so on ad infinitum. Right? This is not vicious because at every stage there is a determinate propositional content. We could ask, what is it that is true? And at every stage we have a clear answer. But according to Malpass, wholly self-intentional divine thoughts spawn a different regress. Malpass asks us to consider one such thought, the divine thought T. He continues, and this is where we have the second paragraph here. We can ask, what is the content of T? To avoid arbitrariness, the divine conceptualist has to insist that it has itself as its own content. She has to introduce T to play the role of content as well as thought, T of T. So we have been given an answer to the content of the outer instance of T. But now we can ask, what is the content of the inner instance of T? The only answer can be a further iteration of the same pattern, T of T of T. This process clearly iterates forever, but unlike the benign regress, there is no point at which we get a proper answer to the question of the content of the inner instance of T. Thus, it is vicious, end quote. Now, again, I find this somewhat plausible, but not entirely convincing. For this argument would generalize to any case of wholly self-intentional thought. According to the argument, any such thought would be impossible, since it entails a vicious regress. But just phenomenologically speaking, it seems that thoughts of this kind are not only possible, but actual. I mean, I just invite the listener or the viewer to entertain the following thoughts. 1, this very thought is a thought. Or 2, this thought I'm entertaining right now has a qualitative character. I mean, I don't claim that this is a decisive consideration, but by my lights at least, it calls this first problem that Malpass raises into question. Right, we're considering a fifth response to the Brentano problem for Platonism, and under this fifth response, there are kind of two subpoints, and the two subpoints are meant to essentially spell out the fifth response. They're meant to be two problems that arise from a commitment of theistic conceptualism, namely it's seeming to render the intentionality of divine thoughts just unintelligible. And so we have to consider these two kind of extensions of this fifth response. The first one is from Malpass, and it's his vicious regress argument. And I've argued here that that argument doesn't seem to work because there seem to be counterexamples to it. But there is a second response, or there is a second problem that I'm going to raise, and that does kind of have some bite to my mind. So let's move on to that. So that second problem is that if the thought is about and only about itself, the same will apply to all of God's other thoughts that are identical to other propositions. But in virtue of what, then, is one of these thoughts, say, the law of non-contradiction, or LNC, whereas the other is, say, the law of excluded middle, or LEM? After all, they're both divine thoughts, and they're both only about themselves. What then individuates them, right? Like, why is one the law of non-contradiction, whereas the other is the law of excluded middle? I mean, we normally think that thoughts are individuated by their contents, but this doesn't seem to be an option if the contents are numerically identical to the thoughts themselves. There seems to be no explanation of why one of them is the law of non-contradiction while the other is the law of excluded middle, unless, of course, we can point to some additional feature or features of the thoughts, such as there being arrangements or combinations or organizations of properties and relations that individuates them. But in that case, it seems like it's this other feature that accounts for the intentional directedness of the law of non-contradiction thought to the law of non-contradiction in particular. And in that case, the mere fact of being a thought is not doing the explanatory heavy lifting, as it were, when it comes to explaining the intentionality of propositions. That then is the second way to extend my fifth response, and I do find that quite plausible. As does this little cat on the left here. It looks like she's just smoked marijuana, but we can set that aside. So onward we march to my sixth response to the Brentano problem. And that response is that even if divine conceptualism were both simpler and more explanatory than Platonism when it comes to the intentionality of propositions, now I've challenged both of those claims in my first 5 problems, but set that aside, it's a further question whether it is superior to Platonism, all things considered. And I think it's not clear whether this question should be answered in the affirmative, for there are reasonable considerations that tell against it. I only have room for a sketch of some such considerations. Okay, so let's move on to those distinctive problems for theistic conceptualism. Okay, so the first problem is that many propositions are nasty, disturbing, insane, banal, trivial, morally and rationally reprehensible, and unholy. Graham Oppy, in one of the books that I mentioned earlier, develops this, and William Lane Craig as well, in another of those books that I mentioned earlier, develops it as well. So if, as divine conceptualists would have it, propositions are necessarily existent divine thoughts, then God is incessantly and necessarily thinking such horrendous thoughts. If you'll forgive me for the gruesome example, consider the proposition that God loves to torture babies merely to delight in hearing their screams. That's going to be one of God's thoughts, and God's unendingly thinking this, right? This is not only deeply counterintuitive, but also seems to compromise God's holiness and perfection. So, how might the theistic conceptualist reply? Well, take first banal and trivial thoughts. Arguably, it's a mark of good cognition that one thinks what is true, even if the truths in question are utterly trivial or banal. It is still a mark of one's cognitive perfection that one entertains and endorses such truths, or at least it's a mark of perfection, provided that such thoughts don't crowd out, as it were, thoughts of more important matters. And that, of course, is clearly no problem for an infinite intellect like God. Now consider outrageous, insane, and reprehensible falsehoods. Importantly, one can entertain outrageous and reprehensible falsehoods without endorsing them. So this is that second point there under the red response, entertain versus endorse. We can distinguish between entertaining such outrageous and reprehensible falsehoods from endorsing them. So if God entertains them and rejects them, if he doesn't endorse them, well, then God is thinking true thoughts. And again, surely it's a mark of cognitive perfection to have such true beliefs. Moreover, merely entertaining an immoral or nasty thought is surely not sufficient for having a bad or else imperfect or unholy character. Imagine a criminal psychologist who manages to get inside the head of a serial killer to see what sorts of things they're thinking in order to anticipate their next move, say. This need not morally compromise the criminal psychologist. Finally, by entertaining the thoughts in question, God gets a full picture of moral space. That is, of moral facts and properties and relations. And surely this is part of God's cognitive and moral perfection. Many thanks to philosopher Kenny Boyce for bringing some of these replies to my attention. Now, I think that these are really respectable replies. In response, which is what I'm going to develop here under that little green reply there, I'm just going to offer some gentle pushbacks. So, first, even if God doesn't endorse his ungodly thoughts, what drives the problem is simply that he unceasingly ruminates over them, indeed, infinities upon infinities of them. If anything, God's not endorsing, that is, opposing them, arguably compounds the problem. God unceasingly thinks infinities upon infinities of malicious and reprehensible and otherwise ungodly propositions, despite vehemently opposing them. It's hard to see how he wouldn't be like ultra pissed. But second, there may be relevant disanalogies between the criminal psychologist and God under theistic conceptualism. For criminal psychologists have to take periods away from thinking about, for example, horrific cases for the sake of their own psychological well-being, whereas God never gets any such break from thinking about his horrendous and malicious thoughts. The underlying problem is that wicked, that is horrendous and reprehensible and so on, thoughts, those are prima facie inherently unhealthy and or unholy to have on one's mind for any length of time. But perhaps things are different for God. Maybe, God, unlike the criminal psychologist, is not psychologically limited. And arguably, it's precisely because humans have such a limited and frail psychological makeup that they need such breaks. But God is neither limited nor frail in his psychological makeup. And so perhaps this second rejoinder doesn't quite work. Here then is my third rejoinder. Suppose we change the criminal psychologist case so that the criminal psychologist incessantly thought the relevant reprehensible thought. Even when not at their job, even when trying to sleep, even when buying groceries, and even when hugging their kids. There seems to be something clearly inappropriate and unholy here. Indeed, modify the story even further. Suppose there is no serial killer. The criminal psychologist entertains all these horrific thoughts regardless of whether there's a serial killer in relation to whose future actions the thoughts would be useful. Indeed, suppose a criminal psychologist knows that there is no such serial killer and yet still thinks about these things. Something here seems inappropriate and unholy. And yet this is exactly what theistic conceptualists will have us believe about God. even in a world in which God existed alone, he would still be incessantly thinking infinities upon infinities of these atrocious and malicious and reprehensible thoughts. Overall, I do have to admit that I think it's clear that the ungodly thoughts objection is far from decisive. I think there are some intuitions undergirding it, and perhaps those intuitions are evidentially salient. And perhaps classical or perhaps theistic conceptualism incurs at least some theoretical cost in violating such intuitions. But I do have to admit that I think that this ungodly thoughts objection is far from decisive, and I think the jury is still out on it. So the second problem for theistic conceptualism, raised forcefully in Craig's book God Over All, Chapter 5, and others, is that theistic conceptualism unduly restricts God's freedom and control. As Felipe Leon puts it in his dialogue with Josh Rasmussen, quote, in order to explain the objectivity, necessity, and infinity of abstract objects, theistic conceptualism entails that God must think all of his thoughts, and just those thoughts, and must think them constantly, end quote. Given the infinitude and necessity of universals and propositions, for instance, it simply follows that there are positive ontological items distinct from God that are not freely created by God, where free creation, as I use it, implies that God is free to create or refrain from creating. God therefore controls neither the existence nor the character of the abstract landscape. God's sovereignty is thus threatened. The third problem is a bootstrapping worry. And you can see this guy's glorious boots on the bottom here. He's like posing and he's jumping like, wow, what a queen. Anyway, the third problem is a bootstrapping worry. For plausibly, God must already have, or in the case of divine simplicity, already be identical to, in a sort of explanatorily preconditioned manner. Surely God must already have various properties in order to be able to engage in thought and conception or other intellectual activity in the first place. Surely, for instance, God must already have or be identical with the property of being capable of thought, or of being an intellect, or of being powerful. But in that case, properties cannot be identical to or otherwise grounded in God's thoughts, conceptions, ideas, or other intellectual items or activities. For then, some properties would be ontologically prior to themselves, which is absurd. They'd be both prior to themselves and posterior to themselves, in which case they'd be prior and not prior, which is absurd. Now, alternatively, I guess the theistic conceptualist might reject the principle that if God is powerful, is an intellect, is capable of thought, and so on, then he thereby has the properties of, or is identical to his properties of being powerful, being an intellect, being capable of thought, and so on. But the problem with this is that if things can be F without thereby having the property of being F, at least for monadic so-called natural predicates, that is, at least setting aside complex gerrymandered predicates like is GRU or is non-self-exemplifying and so on, well then, why posit properties or universals at all, right? I mean, if something can be F without thereby having the property of being F, what's the point of positing these properties? I mean, such a rejoinder seems to collapse one of the principal motivations for thinking that there are such things as properties in the first place. Now, at this juncture, the theistic conceptualist might say that only properties not had by or not identical to God are identical to or otherwise grounded in God's ideas. That would avoid the bootstrapping problem. But then theistic conceptualism not only posits a radical break in the uniform ontological status of properties, but it also seems unmotivated in that case. If some properties can exist without the help of God's ideas or intellectual activity, why not suppose all of them can? Anyway, the fourth and final problem that I'll be leveling appeals to counterpossible reasoning. The problem, according to Felipe Leon, is that the view gets the relevant counterpossibles wrong. Now, by the way, counterpossibles, that's just a conditional claim. So an if-then claim, so if such and such, then such and such, whose antecedent, that is to say the if clause, is impossible. So like if 1 + 1 = 3, then 1 + 1 = 3. That's an example of a counterpossible. So Felipe Leon gives the following two examples of certain counterpossibles that theistic conceptualism gets wrong. It gives us the wrong result about the truth value of such counterpossibles. So the first example he gives is if God didn't exist, the sum of 1 and 1 would still equal 2. And secondly, if God didn't exist, abstract objects would still exist. Now, I say examples can, of course, be multiplied, right? We can say if there were no minds, the proposition there are no minds would have been true and hence would still have existed. Assuming, of course, that nothing can have a property like the property of being true or the property of being about something or property of corresponding to reality unless it exists in the first place so as to have any properties, right? Non-existent things don't have any properties because they are precisely nothing. So that's another example, right? If there were no minds, the proposition there are no minds would have been true and hence it still would have existed. Moreover, if God didn't exist, things would still exemplify properties and hence there would still be properties, and so on. Now, of course, we have to ask, well, why does theistic conceptualism get these counterpossibles wrong? I should say these are counterpossible under theistic conceptualism because they have God existing as a necessary being. And so any antecedent in which, you're reporting the God's non-existence, that's going to be a counterpossible. So, of course, we have to ask, why does theistic conceptualism get these counterpossibles wrong? Well, theistic conceptualism says that abstract objects of all kinds are identical to or otherwise grounded in God's ideas, or thoughts, or concepts, or other mental items or mental activities. But in that case, if God didn't exist, then God's mental items wouldn't exist. And if God's mental items wouldn't exist, abstracta likewise wouldn't exist, since abstracta for the theistic conceptualist just are God's mental items. Hence, divine conceptualism entails each of the above mentioned counterpossibles, right? If God didn't exist, the sum of 1 and 1 would still equal 2. That's one of the counterpossibles they'd have to deny, because there would be no such thing as the numbers 1 and 2, whose existence we are assuming are required for the proposition to be true, and nor would the proposition that 1 plus 1 equals true even exist so as to bear the property of truth. And so on for the rest of the above mentioned counterpossibles. They're going to have to deny each of them. Now, on traditional Lewis-Stalnaker semantics, you don't need to worry about what that is, but on the traditional Lewis-Stalnaker semantics, every counterpossible is vacuously true. That is, it's just like basically trivially true. Now, many philosophers working on modality and impossible worlds, however, have argued that lots of counterpossibles actually enjoy non-vacuous truth values. They can be non-vacuously, meaningfully, non-trivially true, and non-vacuously, meaningfully, significantly, non-trivially false. Indeed, the legitimacy and non-vacuity of counterpossible reasoning is often taken for granted in philosophy. For instance, it seems perfectly legitimate to reason along either of the following lines. 1, if theism were true, such and such would follow. And also 2, if atheism were true, such and such would follow, right? Everyone reasons like that. Everyone says, hey, if theism were true, this is what would happen, or, this is what we would see, or this is what we would expect to see, or if theism were true, then such and such. And similarly with atheism, people will say, oh, if atheism were true, there would be no objective moral values. That's false, but we can set that aside. But of course, in those two cases, one of those antecedents is not possible, assuming that theism or atheism is necessarily true if true at all, which is the case if God is a necessary being. Nevertheless, it seems obvious that we can make non-vacuously true and false claims employing these antecedents. And tons of different philosophers agree with that. So, but it's also just central in philosophy and everyday reasoning. So, assuming that counterpossibles can have non-vacuous truth values, we can then ask about the counterpossibles entailed by theistic conceptualism. Are they non-vacuously true or false? The objection to theistic conceptualism under consideration says that they are non-vacuously true. It just seems obvious, according to the objectors, that 1 and 1 would still make 2 if God didn't exist. And it just seems obvious that if God didn't exist, non-God things would still exemplify properties and so on. Now, since theistic conceptualism entails that these things are actually non-vacuously false, but they're obviously non-vacuously true, it follows by modus tollens that theistic conceptualism itself is false, or so the argument goes. Now, how are we to respond to this? Or at least how is the theistic conceptualist to respond to this? I mean, it's not clear whether this argument is convincing, or at least whether it should convince theistic conceptualists to abandon their position. I mean, what undergirds the intuition that these counterpossibles are non-vacuously true? On the screen there, I ask in that little red thing, I say non-vacuously false, but that was an accident. I didn't mean to type false. I should have typed true. Oh, well, oh, well. But in any case, what undergirds the intuition that these counterpossibles are non-vacuously true? I mean, it couldn't be an intuition that abstract objects necessarily exist, or that it simply must be the case that if there are non-God things, they exemplify properties. For these necessary truths are inapplicable to impossible worlds, and they don't seem to illuminate the space of nearby impossible worlds in which God doesn't exist. By the way, worlds are nearby each other if they are like really super duper similar to each other. So, for example, one possible world is like exactly the same as our world, except for the fact that like in some isolated region of Greenland in like the 12th century, someone sneezed in that other possible world that they didn't sneeze in this world. And that's the only difference, or one of the only differences, except, a few differences in the air particles around them and whatnot. But anyway, that would be a really nearby possible world to this one. But anyway, it couldn't be what undergirds this intuition? It couldn't be an intuition that abstract objects like necessarily exist, because that's just inapplicable to impossible worlds. And that's what we're considering. So perhaps the idea then is that, it's the closest impossible worlds in which God doesn't exist in those, it's still the case that abstracta exist, that non-God things exemplify properties, that one and one make two, and that the proposition that God doesn't exist is true and hence exists. But it's not clear whether such judgments can be used as arguments against theistic conceptualism. For, plausibly, when we consider the closest impossible world in which the antecedent of the counterpossible holds, it is what we already believe about the antecedent's relation to the consequent that dictates our judgment about the counterpossible's truth value. To see why this is plausible, consider the following claim. We're going to call that claim A. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist. Now, suppose we have two theists, one of whom thinks that God's nature grounds objective moral values, the other of whom thinks that the flourishing and languishing conditions set by the intrinsic natures of creatures themselves grounds objective moral values. Now, both theists regard A as a counterpossible, provided they think God necessarily exists. But I think it's reasonably clear why one of them will regard A as non-vacuously true, while the other will regard it as non-vacuously false. The former will regard the counterpossible as non-vacuously true. So by the former, I mean the theist who thinks that, goodness and badness and whatnot, morality, are grounded in God's nature. So they're going to think that A is non-vacuously true, precisely because they already believe that God is the ground of moral values. Whereas the latter theist will regard it as non-vacuously false. They're going to say, no, A is false. It's false that if God didn't exist, then objective moral values and duties wouldn't exist. They're going to say that's false because they already believe that it is the intrinsic character of creatures, not their extrinsic relation to God or God's nature, that grounds moral values. Now, this case illustrates why one's assessment of the truth value of counterpossibles depends on what one already believes about the antecedent's relation to the consequent. But in that case, what motivates the judgments about the existence of abstracta in the closest impossible worlds in which God doesn't exist is precisely one's prior belief that God doesn't ground abstracta, or that God's mental items aren't identical to abstracta. But in that case, though, one cannot use such abstracta-related counterpossible judgments to argue against theistic conceptualism on pain of begging the question. And so in that case, as I say here on the screen in that last bullet point under the red response, in that case, problem number 4 is question begging. But perhaps all is not lost for the counterpossible objection. So I'm going to give 2 points on behalf of it in response to the above rejoinder. And that above rejoinder is, of course, in that little red there, that response. And so now we're moving on to that little green there, the little 2 responses there. So first, one might worry that this sort of objection will generalize to virtually all philosophical claims. For most philosophical theses are necessarily true, if true at all, and there are usually 2 or more, usually more, philosophical views regarding a given philosophical thesis. If that's right, then virtually all we do in philosophy is consider impossible claims. That is, we reason about counterpossibles. And if that's right, then on the above response, we can't really do philosophy in a way that can properly persuade the other side in any dispute, since one won't accept the proposed counterpossibles unless one is already a believer of the relevant view. So that's the first response. The second response is that some counterpossibles just intuitively seem obviously non-vacuously true or obviously non-vacuously false, regardless of one's prior beliefs about the relation between the antecedent and the consequent. Suppose, for instance, that Philo thinks that only God's commands give us reason to act when it comes to moral actions. Sophia points out that Philo's view entails, absurdly, that even if God had never issued any commands, the fact that one could prevent 1 trillion holocausts by effortlessly lifting one's finger doesn't give one any reason to effortlessly lift one's finger. Now, presumably, in worlds wherein holocausts occur, God, by his very nature, would always command one to prevent holocausts if one could do this by the effortless lifting of a finger. So, Sophia's objection is a counterpossible objection. And I think it's just obvious that Sophia has pinpointed a serious problem for Philo's view. For the relevant counterpossible just seems obviously and blatantly false. Thus, even if one antecedently accepting Philo's view, because of their prior beliefs about the relation between the antecedent and the consequent, even if one antecedently accepting Philo's view would ultimately have to judge the relevant counterpossible as non-vacuously true, they could, and arguably should, still appreciate that this poses a serious challenge to their view, because it just seems obvious that the relevant counterpossible is non-vacuously false rather than true. And this is true precisely because the relevant counterpossible strongly seems non-vacuously false independently of one's view about the relation between the antecedent and the consequent. Okay, so those are the two replies to this red response there. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think the first response or the first reply there holds water, the one where it says this will generalize to virtually all philosophical claims. There are whole hosts of legitimate ways to evaluate philosophical claims, including ones that are impossible, that don't rest on objections like it gets the relevant counterpossibles wrong. We can, for instance, perform reductios on views, teasing out internal incoherencies or tensions therein. We can also compare the competing philosophical views in terms of their theoretical virtues, like explanatory breadth and depth and unification and simplicity and so on. Right? That red response that we are considering, that doesn't reject counterpossible reasoning wholesale. It simply argues for the illegitimacy of one kind of counterpossible objection, namely counterpossible objections that are undergirded by a prior rejection of the view being criticized. But still, I do find this second reply really quite convincing. I mean, one's evaluation of the relevant counterpossible need not be undergirded by a prior rejection of the view being criticized. Even one who accepts Philo's view, for instance, to take that example that I gave, even one who accepts Philo's view can see the patent absurdity of the relevant counterpossible. In general, then, one can simply evaluate the merits of counterpossibles as independently plausible or implausible in their own right. I mean, that might involve a process of reflective equilibrium, wherein one balances one's intuitive judgments with one's prior commitments about the relationship between the antecedent and consequent, of course. But it's simply false that one's judgment about the relevant counterpossible is solely based on a prior rejection of the view being criticized, and hence the charge of question begging is misguided. So I conclude then that this problem number 4, I think it should at least potentially worry theistic conceptualists. I guess it depends on how strong one's intuitions are concerning the falsehood of the relevant counterpossibles. I mean, in my case, I think they're extremely intuitively plausible. I mean, if God didn't exist, 1 and 1 would still equal 2. But in any case, these 4 problems for theistic conceptualism jointly push me to my modest conclusion that it's not at all clear whether theistic conceptualism is superior to Platonism, all things considered. And so that's all that I was aiming to establish with these 4 problems that we're considering. If you want to go more in depth into some of these problems, you can check out my discussion with Felipe Leon on my channel. I think it's entitled From Abstracta to Atheism.
No, I turned wrong.
Here we go.
Left your heart torn. Is that what devils do? Ooh. Took you so long, where only fools go. I shook the angel and young. Now I'm rising from the ground, rising up to you. Filled with all the strength I find, there's nothing I can't do. A stolen burnt your soul. Is that what demons do? They rule the world to me, destroy everything. They bring down angels like you. Now I'm rising from the ground, rising up to you. Filled with all the strength